Clue number 1. Half-buried ground floors. Walk through almost any old city in the world, and if you look carefully, if you really look, you will start to notice something that most people pass by without a second thought. Windows sitting below the level of the sidewalk, doorways that descend rather than rise, entrances that once opened at street level, now sunk into the earth as though the ground itself rose up around them, while no one was watching. It is such a common sight that we have stopped seeing it, and that in many ways is the most unsettling thing of all. Before we go any further, a small but genuine invitation. Wherever you are right now, whatever hour surrounds you, whether it is deep into the night, the quiet of early morning, or somewhere in that strange suspended stillness between the two, it would be something to know. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, because this story reaches into cities across every continent, and knowing that voices from all those different corners of the world are gathering here in the dark around these same buried questions, well, that matters. It makes the wondering feel a little less lonely. Now, back to the ground beneath your feet. The sight of half-buried floors is so widespread across the older districts of the world that urban historians and architects have long had to account for it. And account for it they do, with reasonable explanations that deserve to be heard clearly and honestly. Streets rise over time. Every generation of road builders lays new material over the old. Cobblestones get covered with gravel. Gravel gets covered with packed earth. Earth gets covered with asphalt. And the cumulative effect across decades and centuries is a slow, almost imperceptible creep upward. Cities that have been continuously inhabited for hundreds of years, places like Edinburgh, Bologna, Istanbul, Philadelphia, and Prague, show this layering effect in measurable ways. A street that sits 3 feet higher than it did in 1700 is not a mystery. It is simply time made physical. There are other explanations too. Flooding deposits sediment. Particularly in low-lying cities or those built near rivers, periodic floods leave layers of silt and debris that gradually raise the surrounding grade. Building collapses, fires, and demolitions create rubble that gets incorporated into new foundations rather than removed. And there is the straightforward matter of basement conversions, where what was once a full ground-level room gets reclassified as a cellar or sub-level space simply because the neighbourhood around it has changed shape. All of this is documented. All of it is real. And yet the mud flood theorists, those who believe something far more sudden and total happened to our cities within living memory of the 19th century, look at exactly the same evidence and see something different. They see not a slow creep upward, but a single, catastrophic event. A flood of mud or sediment so vast and so rapid that it swallowed the lower portions of entire cities in what may have been a matter of days or weeks. They look at the half-buried ground floors and ask a different set of questions. Not why did the street rise, but why does the buried level look so finished? Because this is the detail that tends to catch even skeptical eyes. In a building where the ground floor has simply been buried by accumulated street raising over centuries, you might expect that lower level to show signs of gradual abandonment. Retrofitting, utility pipes running through original window openings, architectural features stripped out and repurposed, the messy, accumulated evidence of a space slowly losing its original function. But in many of the examples that researchers point to, particularly in older American and European city centres, the buried levels look unexpectedly intact. Ornate window frames, detailed brickwork continuing below grade with the same care and craft as what sits above. Arched entryways that lead into spaces too complete to have been planned as cellars. Take a walk through the older neighbourhoods of cities like Cincinnati, St. Louis, or certain districts of London. In many spots you will find that the first floor, the one the city now treats as the ground floor, sits several feet above a lower level that was clearly built with equal attention and intention. The windows of that lower level, now sitting below the modern sidewalk, are not crude utility openings. They are proportioned, detailed, and in many cases still fitted with ironwork or stone surrounds that suggest they were once meant to be seen, to open onto a street that expected to look at them straight on. This is the visual argument at the heart of the buried cities theory, and it is not nothing. Mainstream architectural historians point out that many such features were indeed ornamental, even when subgrade, that Victorian-era builders often carried decorative work below the public line as a matter of pride and standard practice. Others note that original ground floors became basements deliberately as wealthier residents moved upward within a building, and the lower levels were given over to servants, storage, and commerce, all of which might still warrant fine finishes. These are credible responses, but they do not always fully satisfy the eye when you're standing in front of a building whose buried level looks less like a converted basement and more like a world that simply stopped one day and was covered over. The mud flood interpretation draws its emotional power from that gap between what we would expect to find and what we actually find. If these lower levels were designed as basements from the beginning, why do so many of them have ceilings of normal room height rather than the compressed dimensions typical of utility spaces? Why are there, in some cases, evidence of fireplaces, of wide doorways, of proportions that suggest human habitation at full scale rather than storage? These are the questions that continue to circulate in communities fascinated by what they call the hidden layer of civilization. What makes the half-buried ground floor so compelling as a starting point for this kind of inquiry is its ubiquity. This is not an anomaly found in one city or one neighbourhood. It is a pattern that recurs across vastly different geographies, different climates, different building traditions. In Edinburgh, you can walk through what are called the closes and discover entire medieval street levels sealed beneath the city that now exists above them. In Rome, layers of previous civilization are simply built upon as though the earth has been rising for as long as anyone can remember. In parts of Chicago, the entire downtown was raised by as much as 10 feet in the years following the Civil War, and the old ground floors were quite literally left behind, buried by intentional civic engineering. That Chicago example is significant because it shows that cities have, historically, been capable of large-scale, deliberate transformation of their own grade levels. The difference, say mud flood theorists, is that Chicago did it with cranes and jackscrews, in plain sight and with extensive documentation. What they believe happened elsewhere, across dozens of cities simultaneously in the early to mid-19th century, left far less of a paper trail. And it is that silence in the records, they argue, that is itself a kind of clue. But we will come to the records in time. For now, we stay at ground level, or rather, below it, because the next time you find yourself walking through the older part of any city, the kind of place where the buildings remember centuries rather than decades, look down. Look at the windows sitting below your feet. Look at the ironwork railings that edge the sidewalk, above spaces that were once open to the sky, and ask yourself, not as a believer in any particular theory, but simply as a curious human, standing on top of something you cannot fully see. What is down there? What level of the world exists just beneath the one you're standing on? And why does it look so much like it was built to be lived in, rather than buried? Clue number 2, windows below the sidewalk. If the buried ground floor is the broad canvas, then the window is the detail that will not let you go. That single architectural element, a rectangle of glass and frame and intention, sitting below the level of your feet as you walk, is perhaps the most quietly disturbing image the buried cities theory offers. Because a window is not a structural element. It is not a foundation stone or a load-bearing wall. A window is a gesture toward the outside world. It is built to be looked through, looked at, to let in light and air and the movement of the street. A window buried below a sidewalk is a window that has lost its relationship with the world it was made to face. Walk the older districts of almost any major European or American city, and you will find them. Sometimes protected by iron grates, flush with the pavement above, letting thin blades of light fall into spaces below, sometimes fitted with small wells of brick or stone, little excavated moats that carve back just enough earth to let the glass breathe, sometimes simply sealed, their frames intact but their purpose quietly surrendered. These are the sunken windows, the light wells, the grated openings that line the foundations of buildings that remember a different grade. And they are everywhere, once you have learned to look for them. Architectural records do offer a language for these features. The light well in particular has a long and legitimate history in urban design. As cities grew denser and buildings pressed closer together, and as lower floors transitioned from principal living spaces to service quarters, designers found ways to channel daylight downward into spaces that the street could no longer reach directly. The iron grate at sidewalk level, the narrow trench of brick running along a building's base, the small barred opening just below the curb, these were practical responses to a practical problem. Darkness, and the need to defeat it without sacrificing the floor above. Victorian-era builders developed these features into something almost elegant, and their presence in a city's architectural record is well documented and well understood. But here is where the competing interpretations begin to pull apart. The practical explanation assumes that these windows were always where they are now, relative to the street, that the light well was designed for a basement, that the grated opening was installed knowing the ground would sit above it. The mud flood interpretation assumes the opposite, that these windows were once at street level or above it, that they faced a world which could see them straight on, and that what sits above them now is not the original grade but an accumulated or sudden intrusion of earth that buried the relationship between the window and the street it was built to address. This distinction matters more than it might first appear, because it changes what you're looking at when you stand at the edge of a sidewalk and peer down through iron bars at a window 2 or 3 feet below your shoes. Either you're looking at a building that always knew its lower levels would be in partial darkness, or you are looking at a building that did not. And the difference between those two readings is the difference between good urban planning and something else entirely. What fuels the pattern seeking is repetition. If this were a feature of one city, one neighbourhood, one architectural tradition, it would be easy to absorb into the ordinary catalogue of regional building practice. But researchers drawn to the buried cities theory document these sunken windows across cities that share no obvious architectural lineage. In cities as different as Edinburgh and San Francisco, in older districts of Istanbul and Philadelphia, in parts of Cincinnati and Bologna that have nothing culturally in common, the same image recurs. The window meant for a world that no longer sits at the right level. That recurrence is what lodges in the mind and refuses to leave quietly. It is worth being honest, though, about what windows alone can and cannot prove. The presence of a sunken window does not establish when or how the street level above it was raised. It does not tell you whether the change was gradual or sudden, deliberate or catastrophic, local or widespread. A window below a sidewalk is evidence of a grade differential. It is not, by itself, evidence of a conspiracy or a buried civilization or a coordinated act of concealment. The honest inquiry holds both of those thoughts at once. Something happened here, and we should be careful about how confidently we describe what that something was. What the windows do, more than prove any particular theory, is ask a question. They face upward toward a street that no longer acknowledges them, toward feet that pass without looking down, toward a city that has learned to live above a layer it has largely forgotten. And that question, wordless and patient, pressed against glass below the level of the ordinary world, is simply this. When the street rose, what stayed behind? We will keep looking, because what the windows hint at, the stairways make impossible to ignore. Clue number 3. Stairways descending from the street. The window asks a question. The stairway demands that you answer it with your body. because unlike a pane of glass you can peer down at and then walk past, a staircase descending below the level of the street is an invitation. It asks you to commit, to leave the current world behind, step by step, and enter something older. And if you've ever done it, if you've ever followed those worn stone treads down from a modern sidewalk into a doorway that sits below the grade of everything around it, you will know that the feeling is not neutral. There is a particular quality to the air in those threshold spaces, a stillness that does not match the street above. You find them in cities that carry their age visibly. A restaurant entrance, where you descend 4 or 5 steps from the pavement into a dining room whose ceiling, once inside, turns out to be at roughly the same height as the street you just left. A shop doorway set into a building's base, framed by stonework that looks as though it has been there far longer than the pavement that now sits above its lintel. A private residence whose front door can only be reached by descending a short flight, the iron railing beside it worn smooth by hands going back generations. These are not rare. Walk slowly through the older quarters of almost any city that has been continuously inhabited for more than a century, and you will find them without trying. The practical explanations are real, and they deserve to be stated clearly. Urban ground levels do rise. They rise through the accumulation of street resurfacing, layer pressed upon layer across decades of repair and improvement. They rise through deliberate grade changes made to improve drainage, to accommodate new infrastructure, to unify the levels of a street that had become uneven through years of piecemeal maintenance. They rise through the deposition of material, rubble from demolished buildings, fill brought in for construction projects, the slow accumulation of what a city sheds and buries in its own foundations. Civil engineers call this raising the grade, and it is a documented ordinary process with records attached to it in cities that kept good records. When a street is raised, the buildings along it face a choice. They can be modified, their entrances rebuilt at the new level, new steps added going up to what was once a ground floor door, or they can remain as they are, and the street simply climbs past them, leaving their original threshold stranded below the new grade. The stairway descending from the street is often the trace of that second choice. The building stayed, the street moved, and the entrance became a descent rather than a level crossing. This much is ordinary. This much can be explained without mystery. But here is where the mud flood interpretation leans in, because the question theorists raise is not whether street levels can rise, it is how much they can rise and how quickly, and whether the scale visible in certain cities is consistent with a gradual process or suggests something far more abrupt. In some cases, the descent is not 2 steps, it is 6, 8, 10. It is a full story below the current street, a doorframe that sits at a depth that implies not decades of incremental resurfacing, but something categorically different. In those cases, the question of whether this is ordinary urban stratigraphy or the signature of a larger, faster, less acknowledged event becomes genuinely difficult to resolve by standing on the street and counting the steps. The visible evidence is the same. The interpretation of what produced it is where the readings diverge completely. There is also the question of the interiors, because when you descend into a space that sits below the current street and find that it is not a basement in the functional sense, not a utility space or a storage room or a mechanical area, but a fully articulated interior with carved details, proportioned windows, finished ceilings, you are looking at something that was built to be seen, built to be inhabited by people who expected to move through it at ground level, not to crouch beneath a city that had grown up around them. A beautifully finished room sitting 4 feet below a modern sidewalk is not making a basement argument. It is making a ground floor argument that the street has overruled. What the stairways offer that windows cannot is a bodily experience of the discontinuity. You do not just look at the evidence, you enter it. You feel the transition between the current world and an older threshold under your feet, step by step, and something in that movement registers at a level beneath argument. Whether the cause was gradual and bureaucratic, or sudden and catastrophic, or something that has no clean name yet, the physical fact is undeniable. You're walking down to reach a door that was built to be walked into directly. The ground between you and that intention is the mystery, and the mystery only deepens when the streets themselves begin to tell their own story. Clue number 4. Raised streets and changing grades. If the stairway is the invitation, the raised street is the mechanism. It is the part of the story that can be found in ledgers and municipal minutes, in engineering reports written in calm language that never once expects to be read as a confession. And that is what makes it so unsettling. Because sometimes the city will tell you, plainly, that it chose to lift itself upward. There are documented cases where streets were deliberately elevated to solve problems that were impossible to ignore. Flooding that turned roads into canals, drainage so poor that stagnant water lingered for days, sewage systems that needed gravity to work, rebuilding campaigns after fires that created an opening to redesign an entire district at a new level. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as cities industrialized and population density soared, changing the grade became a tool. Expensive, disruptive, but sometimes necessary. Dirt and rubble were brought in by the ton. Roadbeds were rebuilt higher, new sidewalks were laid. Sometimes whole blocks were raised in coordinated projects meant to modernize the circulation of a city. And when that happens, earlier architecture doesn't need a single, dramatic disaster to end up half buried. It can happen through policy, through contracts, through the slow insistence of practicality. Imagine a street that sits too low, where water collects and freezes, where horse traffic churns the surface into a filthy slurry, where disease is blamed, rightly or wrongly, on the damp. Engineers propose a solution. Elevate the road, adjust the slope, redirect runoff, tie it into new sewers. The plan passes. The work begins. The grade rises by 2 feet, then 4, then 6. The storefronts along the route are offered a choice. Rebuild your entrances and accept the new sidewalk, or keep what you have and let the street climb past you. Over time, the district begins to look like a place that sank, when in fact it stayed still, and the city rose. This is where the record complicates the more dramatic interpretations. Because if you can point to a documented grade-raising project, complete with dates and budgets, the mud flood theory, at least in that location, doesn't have to be the first explanation. A buried-looking facade might be the aftermath of infrastructure, not catastrophe. A window half below the sidewalk might be evidence of a sewer plan, not a sudden deluge. The simplest reading, in some cases, is that people with clipboards and maps did this on purpose. But the complication cuts both ways, because the existence of planned raising projects also raises a sharper question. Does every buried-looking district have a paper trail that matches what we see? If a street rose by 6 feet, where is the ordnance, the contract, the engineering drawing, the timeline of disruptions? If a neighbourhood was lifted to improve drainage, why do some buildings show consistent adaptation, new doorways, new stoops, while others appear to have been swallowed unevenly, as if the ground rose around them without warning or without a coherent plan? Known civil engineering can explain a great deal. It can explain why lower floors vanish quietly. It can explain why older street levels appear in old photographs like ghosts. It can explain why basements sometimes feel too high, too well lit, too carefully proportioned for underground use. But it cannot automatically explain the anomalies, the places where the grade change seems too abrupt, too inconsistent, or too poorly documented for its scale. And that is the tension you can feel when you walk these streets with the question in your mind. On one side, paperwork, practicality, municipal ambition. On the other, the stubborn local oddities that don't fit smoothly into the official story. A city can raise its streets, that is certain. The quieter mystery is whether the raising always accounts for what was buried, or whether, in some places, it was an answer to something that had already happened. Clue number 5. Basements that look too ornate. Once you start looking below street level, you expect utility. You expect rough stone, cramped ceilings, pipes and dust, a place designed for storage, not for life. And then in some older buildings, you find something that feels like it belongs above the sidewalk. Decorative masonry, laid with the care of a public facade. Tall ceilings that let the air feel generous instead of stale. Brick arches that aren't merely structural, but rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Large windows set into thick walls, windows that, if the room was always a basement, would have stared directly into soil. In some places you find carved lintels, ironwork that looks intentional rather than improvised, even hints of ornament that seem excessive for a space meant to hold coal. It creates an uncomfortable question, and it doesn't require any wild theory to ask it. Were these rooms always meant to be basements? Because if a lower level has the proportions of a main floor, height, light, symmetry, then it becomes plausible that it once functioned as a primary story. A shop floor, a parlour, a lobby, a workspace meant to be seen. And if that's true, then what we call basement might be a renamed survivor, a former ground level demoted by the slow rise of streets, sidewalks, and expectations. This is where time does its quiet work. Neighbourhoods densify, infrastructure thickens, streets get repaved, then repaved again, sidewalks are rebuilt higher to meet new grades, storm drains and sewers demand slope, and slope demands fill. Over decades, a building adapts the way a shoreline adapts. An entrance is moved. A window becomes a smaller window. A room that once opened to daylight becomes something else. Storage, laundry, mechanical space, because the city outside it has climbed. And that shifting use can leave strange fingerprints. A basement with elegant arches might simply be an older style of construction, built when skilled labour was cheap and pride was poured into places we no longer dignify. A tall ceiling might have been practical for ventilation, for boilers, for ice storage, for commercial goods. Large openings could have served a busy street that no longer exists at that level. History has plenty of ordinary reasons for surprising beauty below ground. But this is also why these rooms sit at the centre of mud-flood arguments. Because they don't just look buried, they look reassigned. They suggest a before and after. Not merely a building with a cellar, but a building with a lost ground floor, one that was once open, connected, and part of the public world. If you're inclined toward the more dramatic interpretation, the ornate basement becomes a clue that the official timeline is missing a chapter. It becomes a whisper that something happened fast enough or widespread enough that later generations chose to call the surviving level a basement rather than explain why it ended up there. Still, this clue needs discipline. Aesthetic surprise is not the same as hard evidence. An arched brick ceiling can be beautiful and still be exactly what it appears to be. Excellent 19th century masonry. A large window below grade can mean the street rose. It can also mean the room was designed to borrow light from a courtyard, an areaway, a service lane that has since been filled or built over. So the question isn't, is it ornate? The question is it consistent? Do the windows align with the building's original design, or do they look cut down later? Do the materials match the floors above, or do they change as if a renovation drew a new boundary between eras? Do records mention storefronts at the lower level, old entrances, old sidewalks? Does the surrounding street history support a gradual rise, or does it go strangely quiet right where the architecture grows most articulate? Because when a basement looks too ornate, it doesn't prove a mud flood. It proves something else, something smaller but still unsettling, that what we stand on today is not always the level a building was meant to meet. And once you accept that, you start to wonder how many basements are not basements at all. It's just ground floors that the city decided to forget. Clue number 6, cathedral steps and buried foundations. After the ornate basement, the mind naturally lifts its gaze. It looks for the most public, most permanent buildings in a city, the ones that were supposed to anchor everything around them. Churches, cathedrals, courthouses, city halls, libraries, the places built to outlast weather, politics and fashion. And then you notice how many of them seem to sit low, not small and humble, but sunk, like a heavy object pressed in soft ground over time. A grand doorway reached by descending a few steps from the street. A row of massive stone steps that feels excessive until you realise it's doing the work of bridging two different worlds. The building's true base and the city's current surface. Sometimes you see it in the foundations. Thick stone walls that begin below grade, with tiny basement windows peeking out at the perimeter. Sometimes it's the plaza itself, the open space in front of a cathedral that looks like it has been raised and reshaped, as if the ground around the building has been edited, while the building remained stubbornly where it was. If mud flood theories love any structure, they love sacred and monumental ones. And it's not hard to understand why. A cathedral is meant to be a fixed point, something that doesn't casually change its relationship to the earth. So when a cathedral's entrance feels like it belongs a few feet lower than the street, the image carries a special drama. It whispers that something happened after the building was completed, that the city outside rose or the building sank or both. But long histories can create the same effect without a single catastrophic moment. These buildings are rarely finished once and left alone. They accumulate expansions, side chapels, new facades, repaired towers, reinforced foundations, rebuilt stairs. A church begun in one century can be remodelled in the next. An original ground level becomes a moving target. Even the way people approach the building can be redesigned. A new boulevard cuts through. A tram line needs a gentler slope. A plaza is levelled, paved, landscaped, repaved. The street outside the cathedral is not the same street that existed when the cornerstone was laid. And then there's the practical issue that quietly reshapes entire cities. Water. Drainage demands grade. Sewers demand slope. Stormwater demands predictable flow. If a district floods, the simplest fix may not be poetic or mysterious. It may be fill. Raise the roadway, raise the sidewalks, build up the approaches so water runs where engineers want it to run. Over decades, the ground becomes a layered decision. Brick, gravel, asphalt, fill, then more asphalt, while the cathedral, built on deep foundations, stays relatively stable. Sediment can play a part too, especially near rivers, harbours, and low-lying ground. So can repeated rebuilding after fires, earthquakes, wars, and urban renewal. A city that burns and rebuilds may not clear every fragment down to bedrock. It may cap, level, and start again. None of this requires a secret. It requires time, money, and a preference for building forward instead of digging back. And yet, the suspicion persists because monumental buildings behave differently from ordinary ones. People hesitate to demolish them. They preserve them, shore them up, and compromise around them. When a street grade rises, a house might be reworked or replaced. A cathedral is more likely to be adapted. Stairs are extended. New entrances are cut. Lower doors are sealed. Crypts become more crypt-like. In a sense, the building becomes a fossil in a landscape that keeps accumulating layers. This is where careful language matters. A staircase descending from the modern street is a powerful image, but an image is not a timeline. Looks buried is not the same as was suddenly buried. The question is not whether a cathedral sits low. Many do. The question is how and when, and whether the change is documented in boring ways. Street-raising projects, plaza reconstructions, drainage improvements, renovations that quietly moved the threshold upward. So this clue is best treated like a hinge. It connects the visual drama of sunken entrances to the slow machinery of city-making. And it invites a focused kind of curiosity. If the most sacred and monumental buildings often seem out of sync with the streets around them, is that a sign of an erased event, or simply proof that cities climb layer by layer, while certain stones refuse to move. Clue number 7. Old photos that show lower streets. If cathedral steps feel like a hinge, old images feel like a key. Because now you're not just staring at what a building looks like today. You're staring at what someone else saw before the asphalt, before the repaving, before the next improvement quietly added another layer to the city. Archival photographs, engravings, early postcards, insurance maps, survey drawings, city plans with crisp contour lines and measured elevations. These are the artifacts people reach for when they want to prove the ground used to be lower, when they want to point at a street scene from a century ago and say softly, almost triumphantly, "Look, there it is." And sometimes there really is something there. You find an old photograph where a storefront sits comfortably at street level, and then you visit the same address today, and the street level has climbed to the tops of those old window frames. You find a print showing a curb and gutter that no longer exist, because the curb is buried, and the gutter line is now a seam in a basement wall. You compare an 1880s streetscape to a modern one, and notice how the first floor doors seem to have migrated upward, how the steps have changed, how the relationship between buildings and roadway has been renegotiated. Mainstream history doesn't deny that grades change. It just tends to explain them with paperwork instead of mystery. Paving campaigns, street widening, sewer installations, bridge approaches, flood control, the levelling of hills, the filling of low ground. In that view, the visual record is a witness to urban engineering, messy, incremental, and sometimes dramatic, but not secret. Alternative interpretations look at the very same witness and hear a different testimony. If multiple cities show similar patterns, lower floors lost, windows swallowed, entrances altered, it can feel less like local engineering and more like a coordinated response to an event, a rapid burial, a reset, something that happened fast enough to leave buildings intact but changed enough to require new street surfaces like bandages. The uncomfortable truth is that images can support both stories, depending on how carefully you treat them. Dating is everything. A photograph without context is a dream that looks like evidence. Was it taken before a street-raising project, or during one? Are you seeing the old street, or are you seeing a construction trench that temporarily exposes older layers? In many cities, crews excavated down to lay pipes and rails, leaving deep cuts alongside buildings for weeks or months. A single dramatic shot, men standing far below the sidewalk line, can be nothing more than a sewer installation, captured mid-process, mistaken later for a permanent, earlier street level. Engravings complicate it further. Artists sometimes cleaned up a scene, simplified grades, exaggerated depth for drama, or combined multiple viewpoints into one. Early postcards were retouched, shadows were strengthened, details were removed. A neat line can look like a curb when it's actually a retaining wall, or a trench edge, or an illusion created by contrast. Even maps demand caution. Insurance maps show basements, building materials, and sometimes floor levels, but they also reflect the needs of insurers, not the philosophical needs of modern internet detectives. Contour lines can be read correctly or misread confidently. A cellar on paper can mean many things in practice. And then there's the human temptation that makes this clue so potent: selective comparison. If you want proof of buried streets, you will naturally collect images that show dramatic lowering, deep sidewalks, exposed foundation courses, half-hidden windows. You will skip the boring photographs where the grade looks consistent, or where a known paving project is clearly documented, or where the same street appears unchanged across decades. A collage can become an argument simply by what it leaves out. So this clue works best when you slow down, when you compare multiple images of the same location across time, not just one. When you look for captions, newspaper mentions, municipal reports, engineering plans. When you ask whether the photo shows a finished street or a street in surgery. When you treat the visual record as a starting point, not a verdict. Because yes, old photos can whisper that the city once sat lower, but the whisper doesn't automatically tell you why. It can be the echo of a hidden catastrophe, or the ordinary sound of a city doing what cities have always done. Cutting, filling, raising, repairing, layer by layer, until yesterday's street becomes today's basement wall. Clue number 8. World's Fair architecture and sudden grandeur. And once you've trained your eyes to notice buried curbs and altered thresholds, another kind of evidence starts to glow in the mind like a fever dream. The great expositions, the world's fairs, those brief, dazzling cities that appear in photographs like postcards from an impossible timeline. Palaces, colonnades, domes, heroic stairways, whole districts of symmetry and stone. Built, we're told, for a season, then dismantled, as if grandeur itself could be temporary. This is where the mud flood narrative often sharpens into a single, suspicious question. How did they do that so fast? Because to someone already wondering whether our cities were inherited, the fairs can look less like construction projects and more like an unveiling. Like someone pulled a curtain back for a few months, showed the public a taste of a higher civilization, and then covered it again before anyone asked too many questions. The argument usually goes like this. The architecture looks too sophisticated for its supposed speed. The ornament feels too confident. The layouts seem too complete, too unified. And the photographs, especially from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, can make the structures feel permanent, massive, clean-lined, almost too perfect to be temporary. So the theory suggests these weren't really built then. They were refurbished, reoccupied, borrowed from a prior era that had already mastered the monumental. But documented exposition history offers a different, less occult kind of explanation, and it's worth holding both stories in your mind without letting either one hypnotize you. World's fairs were not casual festivals. They were national projects. They were prestige wars waged in plaster and electric light. Cities competed for them, investors financed them, and organisers planned them years in advance. And most importantly, the fairs were designed to look ancient, regal, and inevitable, because that was the point. The architecture was a language, and it spoke in Beaux-Arts grammar. Grand axes, formal courts, classical orders, domes, statuary, the visual promise that modern industry belonged inside an empire. Beaux-Arts culture trained architects to produce that effect quickly and coherently. It favoured clear rules, repeatable motifs, and disciplined composition. A fair didn't need 100 experimental buildings. It needed a single illusion, a unified city of culture rising out of the ordinary city, as if modern life had finally learned how to look like destiny. And the temporary part, which sounds like the greatest mystery, is also the most practical clue. Many exposition buildings really were built with temporary methods: wood frames, staff ornament, plaster-like mixtures over lath, facades meant to photograph well, meant to impress at a distance, meant to survive long enough to host crowds and then yield the land back to development. If you can build a theatre set, you can build a fair palace, only larger and with more carpenters. That doesn't mean the fairs were flimsy in every sense. Their planning was serious. Their engineering could be advanced. Their infrastructure, power, water, transit, often left long-term marks on cities. Some exposition buildings were permanent from the start, or became permanent later. But the key is that grand and temporary can coexist when the goal is spectacle, not longevity. Still, you can see why this clue seduces people. Because the fairs sit right on top of a deeper discomfort. The feeling that architectural splendour arrives too suddenly in the historical timeline. You flip through images and it's humble streets, modest brick, utilitarian blocks, and then, abruptly, a white city, or an enormous exposition court glowing with perfect symmetry, and it can feel like the record is skipping, like a hidden chapter is missing between the plain and the magnificent. If you already suspect a reset, an event that buried older ground levels and forced people to adapt, Then the fairs can look like evidence of an inherited template, like the organisers were copying something they didn't fully understand, like they were practicing the aesthetics of a civilization that used to be normal, before the layers rose and the windows sank, and the streets became a little higher than they should be. But here's the careful distinction to keep clear. The mainstream story of expositions is well documented. Committees, budgets, design competitions, construction schedules, labour forces, material choices, political motives. There are receipts, contracts, plans, newspaper coverage. There is banality behind the beauty. The speculative reinterpretation doesn't have to be dismissed as silly to be treated cautiously. It's a pattern-reading instinct. It notices that the fairs look like lost capitals. It senses that the public is being shown something staged. And it asks whether the stage is built from scratch or built atop something older. So as a clue, the World's Fair question is not, were these buildings real? They were real enough to hold crowds and shape memory. The question is why they feel unreal. Because when you're already staring at half-buried floors and swallowed windows, a temporary city of marble-looking palaces doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like a confession that someone somewhere knows what our cities used to look like, and knows exactly how to rebuild the illusion, just long enough for history to applaud. Clue number 9. Uniform facades across distant cities. And after the World's Fairs, those brief polished mirages, your attention starts to drift outward. Not just down into the street, but across oceans, across continents. Because once you notice the same kind of grandeur repeating again and again, it begins to feel less like a local fashion and more like a global fingerprint. Walk through an old district in Paris and you'll see orderly rows of stone tall windows, disciplined cornices, iron balconies like a repeating refrain. Then look at St. Petersburg or Vienna or Buenos Aires or parts of New York and Washington, and the rhyme is still there. Columns, pediments, symmetry, masonry that looks meant to last forever. Even when the cities are separated by language, climate and politics, their older cores can seem strangely related, as if they were built from the same kit. To the mud-flood imagination, this is not a coincidence. This is the clue that tries to turn a suspicion into a map. The alternative view whispers, what if these aren't just similar styles? What if they're remnants of one system? One forgotten order? One pre-reset civilization whose buildings were later claimed, renamed and repopulated? If the same facades appear everywhere, the theory argues, maybe the same builders were everywhere. All the buildings were already there, waiting. But there is another explanation, and it's powerful precisely because it's ordinary. Architecture, especially from the 18th through early 20th centuries, travelled like a language. Not by magic, by schooling, by books, by empire, by trade, and by the industrial era's obsession with standard solutions. Start with education. For generations, elite architects were trained in remarkably similar traditions. Classical architecture wasn't just a look, it was a curriculum. Proportion systems, column orders, canonical details, these were treated like grammar. The Beaux-Arts method, in particular, taught designers to compose buildings the way composers write music. Clear themes, balanced sections, deliberate repetition. When the same schools and the same ideals shape thousands of careers, the world begins to share a visual accent. Then there were the pattern books. Before the internet, before mass photography, there were engraved plates and published designs that showed builders exactly how to make a respectable doorway, a proper cornice, a believable temple front. These books circulated widely. They were copied, simplified, adapted. A mason in one city could reproduce what a draftsman admired in another. The result is a global echo, details that look inherited because they were, in a very literal way, inherited through print. Empire and commerce did the rest. European powers exported administrative buildings, banks, courthouses and churches designed to look authoritative, because authority likes to wear familiar clothes. A neoclassical facade says order even when the street behind it is chaotic. It says we are legitimate even when legitimacy is new. And when materials and labour could be moved by rail and ship, the same kinds of bricks, cut stone, ironwork, and prefabricated ornaments could show up in places that used to be too far apart to share a visual culture so quickly. Urban planning made the sameness even stronger. The 19th century loved straightened streets, widened boulevards, aligned facades, uniform cornice heights. Paris is the famous case, but it's not alone. Cities modernized, rebuilt after fires, reorganized for sanitation, commerce and control. Regulations dictated how high buildings could be, how they should meet the street, how windows should line up, how the whole corridor should read as one continuous wall. So you get districts that look like they were stamped out, not because they were ancient, but because they were managed. And yet, even with all that, the uneasy question remains, is resemblance enough? Because here is the trap the mind falls into when it's tired and searching for one clean answer. It sees repetition and assumes a single cause. But similarity can be produced by many forces at once: shared taste, shared training, shared economics, shared materials, and shared political theatre. A courthouse in Ohio might resemble a temple, not because it's secretly older than America, but because America deliberately borrowed the temple's visual authority. A bank in Melbourne might look like London, because London was the brand. The hidden origin interpretation doesn't disappear just because mainstream explanations exist. The feeling of uniformity is real. The timing can still feel strange. The competence can still feel abrupt, especially when it appears alongside half-buried floors and lowered windows, as if the city is wearing an older face above a newer ground line. But as a clue, uniform facades do not prove a suppressed global catastrophe by themselves. They prove something else first, that humans copy what works. They repeat what signals power. They standardize what is teachable. And they build, again and again, in the image of an imagined golden age, sometimes because they remember it, and sometimes because they want you to think they do. And if you're trying to decide whether the world was reset, that distinction matters. Because a global style can spread without a vanished civilization, while still leaving room for a darker possibility, that the style spread so easily because there were already old bones beneath the streets, waiting for someone to dress them in the same familiar costume. Clue number 10. Gaps and silences in the records. And once you've stared at the facades long enough, once you've traced the repeating patterns across maps and continents, the next place your mind goes is not stone at all. It goes to paper, because buildings leave shadows in archives, permits, plans, contracts, fire insurance maps, tax assessments, council minutes, newspaper announcements, photographs labelled in careful handwriting. The ordinary paperwork that, in theory, should stitch a city story together year by year, renovation by renovation, floor by floor. So when people go looking for the moment a street was raised, or the year a basement became a ground floor, they expect to find a clean line, a blueprint, a decision, a record of the work. And sometimes they don't. A set of drawings is missing. The municipal archive has a gap of decades. A building's renovation history is a fog of vague phrases, altered, improved, modernised, with no details. An engineer's report is referenced but never found. The date a sidewalk rose is inferred from photographs rather than confirmed by a formal ordinance. A whole neighbourhood seems to change grade, and the paperwork feels strangely quiet. To the mud-flood imagination, this quiet is not neutral. It feels like a deliberate silence. A missing file becomes a missing truth. If entire cities were buried on purpose, then of course the first thing you'd bury would be the evidence that tells you it happened. And that suspicion has a logic to it, because we rely on records the way we rely on memory. When memory breaks, we wonder who broke it. But here is where the calm, slow work of history steps in and asks you to breathe. Archives are not vaults. They are living things made of fragile materials, handled by tired hands, moved from building to building, sorted under changing rules, and stored under whatever conditions a city can afford. They are interrupted by disasters and politics and boredom, and most of all, by the simple fact that people rarely keep what they don't think they'll need. War does this in the most obvious way. Cities are shelled, administrative buildings burn, records are evacuated in a hurry, then scattered, then forgotten. Regime changes can purge archives too, not always to hide a mudflood, but to erase prior governments, rewrite legitimacy, or simply because storage is scarce and the past is inconvenient. Fire is even more common and more banal, not the cinematic kind, just a warehouse fire, a courthouse fire, a burst pipe that turns ink to blur. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, municipal buildings burned with depressing regularity. Paper is patient until it isn't. Neglect is quieter than fire, but just as destructive. Boxes left in basements, files eaten by damp, ledgers warped by heat, plans rolled and unrolled until they tear, entire collections lost in temporary storage that becomes permanent exile. Bureaucracy adds its own kind of disappearance. Cities reorganise, departments merge and split. One office calls something a street improvement, another files it under sanitation. A permit might exist, but under a different address system, a different building name, a different spelling. Sometimes it's there, and you can't find it because you're searching with modern language for an old category. And then there's the uncomfortable truth. Not everything was documented in the way we imagine. A lot of urban change happened through incremental work. Repaving, regrading, adding fill, replacing sidewalks, project by project, block by block. The result can be dramatic in hindsight, but at the time it was just maintenance, sometimes handled by private owners, sometimes done quickly after a flood, a freeze, a collapse, sometimes recorded only in invoices and short notices, not in grand architectural drawings. Blueprints, in particular, can mislead your expectations. Many older buildings were erected with drawings that never survived, or with plans that were never filed with the city in the first place. Some were built from pattern books, from rules of thumb, from the experience of builders who didn't leave a tidy paper trail behind them. The paper world was always thinner than the stone world. So why do gaps still feel so suspicious? Because absence is emotionally loud. It creates a vacuum, and the mind hates vacuums. If you already suspect a reset, every missing permit feels like confirmation. If you already trust the official timeline, every missing permit feels like a boring administrative flaw. The same silence can be translated into two different stories, depending on what you walked into the archive hoping to find. This is where historical method matters, because it's designed to keep you from falling in love with one translation too quickly. Source criticism asks simple, stubborn questions. Who created the record and why? What survives and what tends to vanish? What other sources should exist if a certain event happened? Newspaper reports, budgets, engineering journals, lawsuits, diaries, insurance maps. Do multiple independent sources point in the same direction? Or are we building a tower on a single missing page? And just as important, does a gap appear only where you want it to? Or is the archive full of gaps everywhere, even in topics nobody would bother to hide? Missing records can absolutely invite questions. They can justify curiosity. They can even point to real wrongdoing, corruption, negligence, political embarrassment, the everyday cover-ups that happen in plain sight. But missing records, by themselves, do not prove a grand conspiracy. Silence can mean secrecy. It can also mean loss, chaos, and the unglamorous fact that history is often held together with staples and dust. And still, the unease remains. Because if you can't easily trace when a street rose, when a doorway sank, when a floor became below grade, then the city's transformation starts to feel like it happened outside the story you were given. Not necessarily because someone is hiding it, but because the story was never written cleanly in the first place. And that's the strange power of this clue. It doesn't give you a smoking gun. It gives you a dim room and a half-open cabinet, and it teaches you how quickly certainty can be manufactured out of missing paper, which is exactly why the next clue matters so much, because sometimes when the documents go quiet, the ground itself speaks. Clue number 11. Excavations that reveal older cities below, because when the documents go quiet, the ground has a way of answering anyway, not with speeches, not with declarations, but with layers. A sidewalk is cut open for a new pipe, and suddenly there is an older curb line tucked beneath the asphalt, like a fossil rib. A construction crew digs for a foundation, and the bucket scrapes something that isn't natural rock. Brick, cut stone, a threshold, a drain, a street surface that once carried footsteps and cartwheels, and then, somehow, got left behind under the city that came after. This is not rare. In many of the world's oldest places, you can watch history stacked like pages. Archaeologists have a word for the simplest version of it: superposition. In calm terms, it just means that, in an undisturbed sequence, lower layers were laid down first and higher layers came later. The idea is almost childlike in its clarity. A floor gets used, dirt and debris accumulate. A building collapses, someone levels the rubble, a new floor is laid. Repeat that cycle for long enough, and the city becomes a layered cake, each layer a former ground level that, at one point, was simply the present. You see this in classical cities where streets were repaved again and again, each new surface slightly higher than the last. You see it in places where floods deposit silt, where earthquakes topple masonry into the streets, where fires leave ash and rubble, where wars leave shattered blocks that are easier to bury and build over than to clean down to bedrock. Sometimes the accumulation is slow and almost boring, centuries of sweeping, dumping, rebuilding, and raising thresholds to keep water out. Sometimes it's sudden. One disaster, one clean-up, one decision to fill rather than excavate. Either way, the result can be uncanny when you first confront it, because an older city below feels like a secret. It feels like someone did it on purpose, and sometimes someone did. There are accepted cases where whole districts were deliberately entombed, built over after catastrophes, replanned to suit new streets, or sacrificed for sanitation. After major fires, cities have been known to clear ruins by pushing debris into low areas and raising grades. After repeated flooding, engineers have raised embankments and roads, and building owners have adapted by turning old ground floors into basements. Fortifications were buried when they became obsolete. Harbours silted up and became neighbourhoods. Moats became streets. The buried layers are real. The older pavements are real. The doorways that now open into soil are real. And this is where mud flood theories find one of their strongest emotional footholds. Because once you accept that one city can contain several cities stacked beneath it, the leap to, then maybe our modern cities were covered, all at once by something massive, starts to feel less like fantasy and more like a pattern. Your mind begins to stitch together the clues: half-buried windows, stairways that drop, ornate basements, raised streets, silent paperwork. If ancient streets can end up underground through ordinary processes, then the existence of buried streets in a modern city can feel like a smoking gun, even before you know the story. But history, when it is behaving responsibly, asks for a slower kind of attention. Because there is a difference between cities accumulate layers and entire modern cities were intentionally covered in a coordinated event. Archaeology is very good at the first claim. It is careful, methodical, and, most important, testable. Layers can be dated. Not perfectly, not always easily, but in multiple ways. Coins in fill, ceramics in trash layers, newspaper scraps, bottle marks, machine-made brick types, mortar chemistry, timber dating, changes in sewer technology, shifts in road materials. Even the style of nails and the cut of lumber can anchor a layer in time. Archaeology also maps relationships. Does the fill sit neatly against a wall, as if intentionally backfilled? Or does it slump and slope like a natural deposit? Are there water-laid sediments with telltale sorting, fine silts settling in quiet conditions, heavier material dropped first? Are there signs of rapid burial, objects left in place, rooms sealed with contents intact, or signs of gradual change, where spaces were emptied, modified, and repurposed before being covered? This is what separates a story from a stratigraphy, and it's also where urban mud-flood debates often struggle, because cities are noisy, they are disturbed environments, streets are torn up and relaid, trenches cut through older layers, utilities slice the past into ribbons, fill is imported from elsewhere, mixing time periods like a shuffled deck. The ground under a city is not a pristine archive, it's been edited. So when someone points to an excavation photo, an old wall beneath a newer one, a street surface under another street surface, the responsible next question is not, what are they hiding? It's, what exactly is this layer? And how do we know? Is it an ancient street buried by centuries of rebuilding? The normal rise of an occupied place? Is it a basement that became a cellar after the grade rose for drainage? Is it debris from a known fire or earthquake that was levelled and built over? Is it landfill reclaiming a shoreline? Is it a planned regrade documented in engineering reports, even if the paperwork is scattered? Or is it something that genuinely doesn't fit, something widespread, synchronous and oddly consistent across neighbourhoods that had no reason to share the same story? This is the line between archaeology and speculation. Archaeology wants multiple converging measurements. Speculation wants one striking image. And still, you can understand why the broader theory feels plausible to so many people, even if you don't accept the largest claims. Because once you've stood in a dugout trench and looked at a former street level beneath your feet, once you've seen how easily a ground floor becomes an underground room, the modern city stops feeling fixed. It starts to feel temporary, like it too is just one thin layer that could be covered, repaved, renamed and forgotten. And that is the unsettling truth at the centre of this clue. Not that there must have been a single, deliberate burial of entire modern cities, but that burial is not exotic. Layering is not impossible. Hidden streets are not automatically imaginary. The ground can hold more history than the official story has room to narrate. And once you've admitted that, the next question becomes inevitable. Because if layers can form naturally, and can also be created by planning, disaster, and convenience, then what happens when an explanation is offered that is so simple, so comforting, so repeatable, that it smooths every buried layer into the same tidy tale? That's where the cover-up story learns to survive. Clue number 12. Why the cover-up story endures. Because once the mind is primed to notice buried things, it doesn't stop at architecture, it starts noticing tone. Language. The way official explanations are delivered. A regrade becomes routine improvement. A filled-in doorway becomes a later alteration. A row of windows below the sidewalk becomes a basement. And those phrases may be true, in the narrow technical sense, but they can feel emotionally false because they don't match what your eyes are seeing. You are staring at a building that looks like it's wearing the earth like a heavy coat. You are staring at steps that descend into what should be open air. You are staring at an elegant facade that seems designed to be admired, and yet half of it is missing, swallowed by pavement and time. And when the official answer feels small next to the image, people reach for an answer that feels the same size as their unease. That is the first reason hidden history narratives hold on so tightly. They don't just offer information, they offer relief. Relief from the suspicion that you're the only one who sees something strange. Relief from the embarrassment of asking questions that get shrugged off. Relief from the loneliness of being told in 100 quiet ways that curiosity is childish and that the story is already finished. A cover-up story tells you the story is not finished. It tells you that the confusion you feel is not a personal failure. It's a signal, a clue, a door that opens the moment you stop apologizing for what you notice. And it also fits a modern mood, because distrust of official explanations doesn't come from nowhere. People have watched institutions get things wrong, then rewrite the timeline. They've watched inconvenient details be minimized, inconvenient reports be filed away, inconvenient voices be labeled as fringe. Sometimes that distrust is inflated into paranoia. Sometimes it is earned, but either way, it becomes a lens. Once you're wearing that lens, every missing record looks intentional. Every vague description sounds like misdirection. Every clean museum plaque feels like it was polished too hard. And then there is the visual pull of half-buried architecture itself, which is almost unfairly persuasive. It doesn't require you to be an expert. It doesn't require a timeline. You don't need to read a paper to feel the strangeness of it. A photograph of a street-level window that is now shoulder height in dirt speaks in a language older than footnotes. The image carries its own argument, and the argument is simple. This used to be above ground. Even when the explanation is ordinary, that fact remains. The question is not whether a level changed. The question is how. How fast, how wide, how consistent, and whether the story you're being told is specific enough to be tested. Because there are many ordinary ways to get a buried first floor. Grades are raised to improve drainage. Streets are built up over old cobbles. Sidewalks are laid higher to match new roadbeds. After fires, rubble is levelled and built over. After floods, silt is cleared imperfectly and thresholds are lifted. New sewers demand new slopes, shorelines are filled, riverbanks are armoured, a city grows, and the ground becomes a construction material. None of that requires a single, coordinated event. None of it requires a hidden civilization. It requires time, water, and decisions, some boring, some desperate. And yet, sometimes the ordinary explanations don't feel complete, not because they're false, but because they are local. They explain one block, one project, one decade. Meanwhile, your eyes keep collecting similarities across neighbourhoods, across cities, across continents. A basement with ornate stonework here, a church with steps that feel too tall there, a run of uniform facades in one region that echoes a run of uniform facades far away, a pattern of lowered windows that repeats like a refrain. The human brain is built to connect repetitions. It is built to turn them into meaning. That is how we survived. That is how we predict weather. That is how we recognize faces. And that is also how we sometimes overfit the world into a story that is more elegant than reality. The cover-up narrative endures because it offers a single cause for many confusing details. A single cause is comforting. It turns a messy archive into a clean line. It turns dozens of small uncoordinated changes into one dramatic moment. It turns "we don't know exactly" into "we do know," and they hid it. And that is powerful, especially in a world where uncertainty is constant. But history, when it is gentle and honest, makes room for two truths at once. First, a surprising amount of what looks like burial can be explained by normal urban change, disaster cleanup, and engineering decisions. Those explanations exist in city plans, in newspaper articles, in sewer reports, in property records, in building permits, in insurance maps. Scattered, imperfect, but real. Second, some sites still deserve closer attention, not as proof of a global secret, but as local puzzles. Places where the documentation is thin, places where the stratigraphy is odd, places where the changes seem too abrupt, too uniform, or too poorly described for something that reshaped daily life. And this is where the cover-up feeling can be reframed into something more useful. Not someone is hiding everything, but our records are incomplete and our public storytelling is simplified, because most cover-ups, in the mundane sense, are not a room full of villains. They are 1,000 small choices to summarize, to standardize, to move on, to rebuild, to rename, to pave, to file, to forget. The past doesn't have to be deliberately erased to become hard to see. It only has to be inconvenient. So if you feel the pull of this story, let it slow you down instead of speeding you up. Let it turn into questions you can test where you live. What do old fire maps show? When was the street grade raised? What do sewer plans require? What's in the fill? Brick rubble, ash, layered silt, mixed trash. Is there a known flood, a known fire, a known replan? Is the basement original or a converted floor? Stay with the mystery, but don't rush to own it, because certainty is not the same thing as understanding. And if you want to keep digging into these clues with me, like the video, share what you've noticed in your own city in the comments, and subscribe for more quiet history you can fall asleep to, curious, careful, and always unfinished.